Montana Territory, December 1881. There's smoke rising from the mountain. Not from a chimney you can see. Not from a cabin perched on the slope. The smoke is coming from inside the rock itself, curling out through a crack in the granite face like the mountain is breathing. The settlers passing below stop and stare. Some shake their heads. Others laugh nervously. One woman crosses herself. He's finally lost his mind, someone mutters. They're talking about Silas Mackard, a timber hauler who arrived in the valley 6 months earlier. He tried building a proper cabin that autumn. Tried and failed. The ground froze before he could sink foundation posts. The wind tore through every gap in the log walls. By November, his first structure had collapsed under heavy snow. Now he's doing something nobody's ever seen before. Something that breaks every rule the frontier taught them. He's building a home inside the mountain. What Silas understood that cold December, what would take his neighbors an entire winter to learn, was that sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight nature. It's to let nature do the heavy lifting. But first, he'd have to survive the mockery, the isolation, and the worst cold snap Montana had seen in 20 years. Before we go further, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you real frontier engineering that actually worked when survival wasn't optional. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Silas Mackard wasn't a dreamer. He was a hauler. Ox teams, timber runs, supply routes through the Bitterroot Range. Practical work. Survival work. But practical doesn't mean much when the ground turns to iron in October. His first cabin attempt taught him that lesson hard. He'd selected a clearing near Rattlesnake Creek, good timber access, close to water. Standard frontier logic. But the foundation posts wouldn't sink. The frozen soil rejected every stake. He built anyway, stacking logs without proper anchoring, chinking the gaps with moss and mud. The structure lasted 3 weeks. The first real snowfall crushed the roof. The walls splayed outward like a broken basket. Silas spent 2 nights sleeping under his wagon, wrapped in every blanket he owned, temperatures dropping to 15 below. His oxen huddled close, their breath freezing midair. That's when he saw the cave. He'd passed it a dozen times hauling timber up the mountain trail. Just a dark mouth in the granite, maybe 12 feet wide, nothing special. But that second night under the wagon, shivering so hard his teeth cracked together, he remembered something. Caves don't freeze. It wasn't a plan. It was desperation with a direction. He moved his gear into the cave entrance the next morning. Just to get out of the wind, he told himself. Just until he figured out his next move. He built a small fire near the opening, using rocks to reflect heat inward. And for the first time in weeks, he slept without shaking. The cave ran back about 30 feet, narrowing as it went. The floor was dry, surprisingly level. The walls were solid granite, cold to the touch, but not freezing. No ice, no moisture beading on the surface. Silas sat there that third morning, watching daylight creep across the stone, and something clicked. Everyone else was building against winter. Maybe he could build with it. Use the mountain itself as his walls. Let the stone hold heat the way it held the cold, slowly, steadily, all winter long. It sounded insane even to him, but staying out in the open sounded worse. He started hauling logs the next day, not to build a cabin, to seal a cave. Silas's plan was simple in concept, radical in execution. He would frame the cave entrance with logs, creating a front wall and door, effectively turning the cave mouth into a living space. Then he'd build deeper, carve out a sleeping chamber 8 to 10 feet back into the mountain, where the stone stayed stable and the temperature never swung wild. The front room would handle daily life, cooking, tool storage, sitting by the fire. The back chamber, surrounded by granite on 3 sides, would be the sleeping quarters. 1 firebox, 2 spaces, all wrapped in millions of pounds of thermal mass. Here's what Silas understood, even if he couldn't put it into physics terms. Rock absorbs heat slowly and releases it just as slowly. A log wall might warm up fast near a fire, but it also loses that heat the moment the fire dies. Stone doesn't. Stone remembers. He built the front wall 8 feet high, using the best timber he had. Chinked tight, Small door, small window. He didn't want to heat the whole valley, just the space he'd live in. The chimney was pure improvisation. He found a natural fissure in the cave ceiling, about 15 feet back. It vented straight up through the rock, emerging somewhere on the slope above. He stacked stones to create a firebox beneath it, shaping a crude but functional draft. Smoke rose. Heat stayed. The sleeping chamber took longer. He didn't excavate much, just cleared loose rock, leveled the floor with smaller stones, and framed the entrance with timber to hold blankets as a door. The space was tight, 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, barely tall enough to stand. But it was surrounded by granite, insulated by the entire mountain. He spread straw on the floor, built a low platform for sleeping, hung wool blankets to partition it from the main room. To anyone passing by, it looked like a man sealing himself into a tomb. The log front wall seemed pathetic against the scale of the mountain. The smoke coming from inside the rock looked unnatural, wrong. Silas didn't care. He had walls that wouldn't blow over, a foundation that couldn't freeze, and more insulation than any cabin in the valley. Now, he just had to prove it worked. Word spreads fast in a frontier settlement. By mid-December, everyone within 20 miles knew about the cave dweller. They didn't call him Silas. They called him the mole, the bear man, the one who gave up. When neighbors rode past on the trail, they'd slow down, stare at the log wall sealing the cave mouth, shake their heads. Some laughed outright. Others muttered prayers, convinced Silas had lost his grip on sanity. Living in a hole like an animal, one trapper said at the trading post, loud enough for everyone to hear. That's not surviving. That's surrendering. A woman from a nearby homestead told her husband she wouldn't let their children near that dark place. Too easy to imagine the mountain collapsing, she said. Too much like a grave. But the worst came from Everett Calloway, an experienced carpenter who'd built half the cabins in the basin. Everett had helped Silas on his first failed structure, and he took the cave project as a personal insult. Stone weeps, Mackard. Everett told him one afternoon, standing at the cave entrance with his arms crossed. You'll wake up sick from the damp. If you wake up at all, that rock could shift any day. One tremor, and you're buried. Silas invited him inside to feel the walls. Dry, stable. Everett refused. A real man builds a cabin, Everett said. Faces winter head on. You're hiding. And come spring, when you crawl out of that hole pale and half dead, don't come asking for help rebuilding. Silas didn't argue. He just kept hauling firewood, a modest pile compared to what his neighbors were stacking. That became another joke. Look at his wood pile, someone said. He'll freeze by January. Silas chopped, stacked, and stayed quiet. He'd learned long ago that you can't argue someone out of certainty. You just wait for winter to make the case. And winter was coming. Not the usual Montana cold. Something worse. Something that would strip away every assumption about what it took to survive. January 12th, 1882, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. By nightfall, it was 15 below zero. By morning, 25 below. The kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground. The kind that makes your lungs ache with every breath. And it stayed. For 3 weeks, the thermometer never climbed above zero. Most days hovered between -15 and -30. The wind came in gusts that knocked snow from the trees and drove the cold straight through every crack, every gap, every poorly chinked wall in the valley. Wood consumption skyrocketed. Families who thought they'd stocked enough for the winter found themselves rationing by the second week. People started burning furniture, fences, anything that would fit in a firebox. At the Henderson cabin, 2 miles from Silas's cave, the family kept the fire roaring day and night. They burned through a cord of wood every 4 days. The interior temperature still hovered around 35 degrees. Frost formed on the inside walls. The children slept in layers, huddled together, shivering under piles of blankets. It was the same story across the basin. Cabins that seemed solid in autumn turned into ice traps in January. Heat poured out through gaps in the logs, rose straight up through shake roofs, vanished into the wind. No matter how much wood people burned, the cold won. Everett Calloway's cabin, the best-built structure in 20 miles, kept a steady 40 degrees, but only with 15 logs a day feeding the fire. His wife wrapped heated stones in cloth and placed them in the children's beds. His hands cracked and bled from constant wood splitting. And every night, riding past Silas's cave on the way to check trap lines, Everett saw that thin line of smoke curling from the granite. Just a trickle, like the mountain was barely working. On January 29th, Everett stopped, tied his horse, walked up to the cave entrance. He knocked on the log door. Silas opened it in his shirt sleeves. Not a coat, not a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Just a wool shirt, dry and warm. Everett stared. "What's the temperature in there?" Silas stepped aside. "Come see for yourself. Stay with me." Because what Everett found inside that cave didn't just surprise him. It humiliated every assumption the settlement had made about winter survival. Everett Calloway stepped inside and stopped cold. The warmth hit him like a wall. Not the sharp, dry heat of a roaring fire. Something gentler, more even. The kind of warmth that settles into your bones instead of scalding your face while your back freezes. The main room was modest. A small fire burning in the stone firebox, tool racks along the log wall, a simple table and chair. Nothing fancy, but the temperature was unmistakable. "How many logs are you burning a day?" Everett asked, his voice tight. "3. Maybe 4 if it drops below -20. Everett's jaw tightened. He was burning 15. Minimum. Silas led him deeper, past the wool blanket hanging in the doorway, into the sleeping chamber carved back into the mountain. The space was small, intimate, lit by a single candle. Straw bedding, wool blankets folded neatly, stone walls on 3 sides. Everett touched the granite. It wasn't cold. It was cool, like a cellar in summer. But it wasn't pulling heat from the room. It was holding it. "What's the temperature back here?" Everett asked. 45 degrees, Silas said. "Give or take. It doesn't swing much. Fire dies at night, and by morning it's still 40, maybe 38. Couple logs get it right back up." Everett did the math in his head. Outside, -25. Inside Silas's sleeping chamber, 45 degrees. That was a 70-degree difference. And the man was using a quarter of the wood Everett burned to keep his family at 35. "Ow!" Everett's voice cracked slightly. Not anger. Disbelief. Silas walked back to the main room, gestured at the stone walls, the firebox, the narrow entrance. "The mountain does most of the work. Rock absorbs heat slow, releases it slow. I'm not heating space that doesn't need heating. No drafts. No wind. The cave stays stable, doesn't freeze, doesn't bake. I just add a little fire to keep it comfortable." Everett stood there for a long moment, staring at the firebox. 3 logs smoldering, barely an effort. Meanwhile, his family was burning everything they had just to stay functional. "You let me call you a coward," Everett said quietly. "You weren't wrong to worry," Silas replied. "Stone can weep. Caves can collapse. But this one's solid, dry, and it's kept me warmer than any cabin I could have built." Everett left without another word. But 2 days later, he was back, this time with a notebook, asking about ventilation, moisture, firebox placement, how deep the chamber went. Word spread faster than the cold. By early February, people stopped laughing. They started measuring. Henderson's cabin, 12 logs a day, interior temperature 33 degrees, ice on the inside walls. Calloway's cabin, 15 logs a day, 40 degrees, constant feeding required. Silas's cave, 4 logs a day, 45 degrees in the sleeping chamber, stable overnight. The math was brutal. In identical conditions, Silas was using 70% less wood and staying warmer. The numbers didn't lie. And in a winter that was killing livestock and burning through reserves, numbers were the only thing that mattered. People wanted to know how. They wanted to know if they could do it too. And Silas, the man they'd mocked for hiding in a hole, suddenly became the most sought-after advisor in the basin. Spring came late in 1882. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April. By then, Silas Mackert wasn't an oddity anymore. He was a reference point. Families who'd barely survived the winter started asking questions. Not just polite curiosity, desperate, practical questions. How did you find a good cave? What if there's moisture? How do you vent smoke through rock? Can you expand it? Is it safe for children? Silas answered everyone. He walked people through the basics. Look for dry caves with natural ventilation. Test the walls for stability. Seal the entrance properly. Build your firebox under a natural draft. Keep your sleeping area deep where the temperature stays constant. He didn't preach. He didn't gloat. He just explained what worked. And people listened. By the winter of 1883, for families within 20 miles had dug back into hillsides or adapted existing caves. Not exact copies of Silas's setup. Each one adjusted for local geology, family size, available materials. But the principle was the same. Let the earth do the insulating, use thermal mass to hold heat, minimize wood consumption. The Hendersons built a dugout home with a stone back wall pressed into a hillside. They reported half the wood usage of their old cabin and 10 degrees warmer on average. A trapper named Samuel Cortland found a shallow cave near Lolo Pass and framed it with timber, creating a hybrid structure. He wintered there with his wife and infant son. Warm, dry, safe. Even Everett Calloway, the man who'd called it madness, modified his cabin, adding a stone heat wall on the north side and banking earth against the foundation. It wasn't a cave, but it borrowed the idea, and it worked. The technique didn't get written down in any manual. It didn't get a fancy name or a patent. It just became part of the local knowledge, passed along through demonstration and necessity. By 1885, the idea had spread to other parts of Montana Territory. Settlers in the Bitterroot, the Flathead, the Boulder River Valley, people building into hillsides, using rock as thermal batteries, designing small, efficient spaces instead of drafty, wood-hungry cabins. Some called them mountain shelters. Others called them stonebacks. A few just called them Mackert cabins, though Silas never claimed ownership. He didn't need to. The winter of 1882 had proven something that no argument, no expert opinion, no amount of ridicule could disprove. Sometimes the best way to survive isn't to conquer nature. It's to work with it, to let the mountain be your walls. To trust that the earth, slow and steady, will hold the heat you need when the cold tries to take everything. Silas Mackert didn't just survive that winter. He proved that what looked like cowardice was actually the smartest engineering decision anyone in the valley had made. And when the next brutal winter came, and it always does, the people who'd learned from him stayed warm, stayed safe, and remembered that survival isn't about force. It's about paying attention to what the land is already offering. Here's what we've lost in the rush toward modern convenience: the ability to see the land as a partner, not a problem. Silas Mackert didn't invent anything. He observed. He adapted. He trusted that 1,000,000 years of geology knew more about insulation than 6 months of frontier carpentry. That sleeping chamber carved into granite? It was doing what we now call geothermal stabilization. The stone walls acted as a thermal battery, absorbing heat during the day and radiating it back at night. The cave's natural temperature regulation meant Silas wasn't fighting wild swings. He was working with a baseline that never dropped below freezing. Modern science would call it passive heating. Thermal mass. Earth-sheltered design. The frontier just called it survival. And here's the part that should bother us. We've forgotten more about living with the land than we've learned in the last century. We've traded stone and earth for drywall and fiberglass. We've replaced observation with HVAC systems. We've built houses that require constant energy input just to stay livable. Silas's cave used 4 logs a day. Your average modern home in Montana uses the equivalent of 50 to 80 logs a day in heating costs during winter. We haven't gotten better. We've just gotten louder. The people who mocked him weren't stupid. They were following the rules they'd been taught. Build square, build above ground, build like everyone else. Tradition isn't always wisdom. Sometimes it's just repetition. Silas broke the pattern, not because he was smarter, but because he was desperate enough to see what was actually in front of him. The mountain wasn't an obstacle. It was an ally. The cold wasn't something to fight with brute force. It was something to redirect, to slow down, to negotiate with through mass and geometry. And the wisdom wasn't in some manual or expert opinion. It was in watching, testing, adjusting, and trusting what worked, even when it looked insane to everyone else. That's the lesson. Not just about caves or cabins or frontier survival. It's about paying attention, about respecting what came before the blueprints, about understanding that sometimes the old ways weren't backward. They were just precise in ways we've forgotten how to see. Silas Mackert stayed warm with 4 logs while his neighbors burned 15. Not because he was lucky, because he stopped building against the mountain and started building with it. And when spring came, the people who survived didn't forget. They just stopped laughing. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? And if this story taught you something, if it made you think differently about survival, about engineering, about working with nature instead of against it, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you real frontier techniques that actually worked when lives were on the line. No fluff, no theory, just proven methods from people who didn't have the luxury of being wrong. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.